in and out of the Beltway. From large cities to small towns to the rural heartland. From sea to shining sea. This is Wehman, Brunson, and Vernuccio. Inside the News.
Welcome back to another edition of Inside the News. Glad to have you with us. A lot going on this week. We're going to get right to it, but let's introduce the guys. Frank Vernuccio is with us. He's with the American Analysis of News and Media, top left. How you doing today, Frank?
Great to be with you, and hello to our audience.
Absolutely. And Ben Brunson, he's in the bottom middle, the author of the Falstaff, Enigma, and Esther, Sling. How you doing today, Ben?
It's a great day, gentlemen. Always a pleasure to be with you both.
All right. We're going to be talking about the United States Postal Service, the cops in Seattle, the COVID mess, the Iranian tankers. That we've got a lot on the whole plate here, plus Biden and the DNC. So let's get right to it. Frank, this deal with the United States Postal Service, it almost makes you want to laugh, except this is now the newest attack that the Democrats are now putting forward. It's almost laughable, but yet it's still serious, isn't it, Frank?
Well, it's serious because some people will take it seriously. And historical memory being so short, people forget that in August of 2016, while Obama was in his last year of his presidency, there was a bit of a stir when 12,000 postal boxes were removed. Of course, it didn't make much news then. It was just a report that came out. A couple of people complained, but it never really reached the major level of complaints we have now. This is something done periodically by the U.S. Postal Service. They review which boxes are no longer taking in a volume of mail. It's a routine thing. But of course, the Democrats, not having any real issues to complain about, have decided to make this some vast conspiracy from the White House to somehow weaken the Postal Service.
You know something, Ben? It seems like the more you seem to be in trouble on some kind of an election, you start looking for more things to distract the other people, and you start making up stuff. Is what I was going to say there, Ben.
Well, this is the latest hoax by the Democrats. We get bombarded with one after another. Russia, Ukraine, whatever it is. Now they seized on this. This is all enabled by a willing and complicit left-stream media that goes along with these ridiculous hoaxes. This is the latest. It's an attempt to, of course, damage Donald Trump. He's stealing the election. Let me quote Al Gore, Trump is putting his knee on the neck of democracy. That's how ridiculous this hoax is.
Does it sound like a George Floyd thing?
Yes, exactly. And as Frank just said, nothing's happening in the USPS that hasn't been going on for 20 years. This issue of trying to right-size the U.S. Postal Service, which chronically loses billions of dollars. It lost $8 billion in the latest fiscal year. You know, this is an age-old issue. But one thing that's key to me is the Democrats are also setting the stage when there is a fiasco over mail-in ballots, which is almost inevitable in this election cycle, and we don't have an outcome on November 4th, and we have disputes and litigation over counting ballots. Of course, this is setting the stage to blame Donald Trump for destroying the Postal Service ability to readily handle all these mail-in ballots. So this is age-old, and I think it's most Americans see through this.
You know, guys, everybody is picked on the postal system. You know, the mail's running late. Oh, I didn't get that bill in the mail. I mean, we've always picked on that. But yet Ben has hit on something here, Frank, that the Democrats are setting the stage. And should either one win big, then the other one is going to complain. But what would be really the complaint is if Donald Trump runs the table and wins huge or bigly, that then the Democrats are really going to be screaming. They just didn't learn from 2016 what was wrong.
Well, part of what's going to happen, and this affects the polls that are coming out now as well, a couple of the big, more populous states like California and New York, of course, are going to presumably go for the Democrat candidate, for Joe Biden.
Yeah.
And that kind of skews the polls, too, because no matter how many people in those major populous states go for Joe Biden in the polls or in the run up to it, it's not going to change the electoral votes from those states. So they could do all they want in terms of telling the pollsters that, so many millions of people prefer Biden over Trump, but it's not going to make any significant difference in terms of the electoral college, which is one of the reasons why the Democrats have consistently over the past half decade or so been against the electoral college. They know that in a couple of the big Democrat controlled states, they're always going to get the majority in terms of the popular vote, but it's not going to make a significant difference whether they win those states by 1 vote or 1 million votes in terms of the results for the electoral college.
You know something, Frank, you've hit on something, and Ben, I think you recognize it as well. Let's take New York State, for example. And when you
take New York State, please.
That's right. Please take it. That was a good one there, Frank. But, when you look at the blue and the red, when it comes election night, you see the blue all around the metropolitan of New York. But then you start looking at rural New York upstate, and it turns more red. And that's what the Democrats want to do. They want to run the table in New York and San Francisco and Los Angeles and Chicago. And they want to forget about the rest of the United States. And that electoral college was a way that our founding fathers evened the playing field so that everybody has a voice.
Well, our founding fathers and their great wisdom, and they did a lot right in setting up the foundation of this country and our Constitution, instituted two great institutional systems to make sure that large coastal cities did not dominate the politics and the direction of this country, to make sure that huge portions of the country were not disenfranchised. They set up the Senate, and the entire point of the Senate, so a little tiny state like Rhode Island has the same proportional representation as California or Florida or New York, is exactly that issue of maintaining states' rights and not disenfranchising states. And they set up the Electoral College for the exact same reason, so that we don't have huge population centers on the coast determining who the president is every 4 years, and that the rest of the country still has a vote and a voice in the system. And that is the point of the Electoral College. It has served us quite well. So we don't disenfranchise a huge portion of this country. And the Democratic attempts to abolish the electoral system would just about ruin our union as a nation, because we would disenfranchise the vast majority of this country geographically.
Frank, Ben has hit on another excellent point here, is that our founding fathers had intense brilliance on setting up our system of government that, even back a couple hundred years ago, they kind of foresaw what could have been problems and what had happened in the past in, like, say, Great Britain.
Yeah, and of course, you have to look at some of the tactics the Democrats have attempted to dissolve that concept. Representative John Dingell, late of Michigan, actually proposed dissolving not just the Electoral College, but the United States Senate as well, for the precise reasons that Ben has outlined. The Democrat ultimate wish is that New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, perhaps St. Louis, and eventually Washington, D.C., would rule the country by themselves. The rest of the votes would be utterly irrelevant under the system that the Democrats are attempting to pursue.
Yeah, and it is interesting that, those are like port cities as well, because even St. Louis is a major port city along the Mississippi River, Ben.
Well, it is, and again, we have outlined exactly why we have the institutions we do in the Electoral College and the Senate. It is critical that they be maintained, and there have been calls like this and throughout our history, one party or another deciding that they could dominate the country based on their population advantage in large cities. So that's why these institutions exist. And again, because of the lack of any civics or history education, a lot of young people, a lot of Democrats don't understand why these institutions exist the way they do. So there's a reason, and it's a very good one and a critical reason for our country to go forward.
This is Wehman, Brunson, and Vernuccio Inside the News. Glad to have you with us. A big shout out to all of our affiliates across the country. Okay, Frank, let's talk about the COVID mess. We'll talk about law and order as we get down maybe in segment number 3. But this COVID mess, and I listed 3: sports, schools, and politics. That down here in Florida, for example, that they wanted to push so far into the sports that they wanted to start it like right now. August the 24th, even though what is known as SMAC, the Sports Medical Advisory Committee, said, let's wait until schools open. Let's see what happens. And then we can start. Maybe it's 30 days later, but we'll still start sports. And yet they wanted to push on forward. And then Joe Biden says masks for everybody. He's almost like he wants to be. And that's indicative of a dictatorship, that if he gets mandatory masks for everybody, that's just, that's like one of those footholds in the door, isn't it?
Yeah, the camel with the nose under the tent, exactly. Part of the problem in our whole COVID discussion is a failure to appreciate actual statistics. We go back to 2012 when the SARS epidemic hit the United States. I believe the total number of deaths was something in the nature of 240,000. We're dealing with, I say only in parentheses because even one death is too many, but we're dealing with only 170,000 deaths coming from COVID. Based on that, we've shut down the country. I fail to see whether that shutdown has actually done any good in terms of ending this epidemic. Look, there are certain factors in certain places which have been responsible for COVID lasting as long as it has and for causing as many deaths as it unfortunately has. Most of those, going back to our prior conversation, have to do with large blue states. We look, for example, at the decision by Governor Cuomo of New York, a Democrat hero, whose decision to put COVID patients in nursing homes was so terrible and resulted in so many deaths that it skewed the entire statistical outlay for the United States. And he did this, not only was it a mistake in doing it, but he had viable alternatives which he chose to ignore for political reasons. Talking about the Javits Center in New York City, talking about the USS Comfort, but apparently using the Javits Center and particularly the Comfort would have been seen as saying that President Trump was doing the right thing in dealing with COVID, and Governor Cuomo chose to have people die rather than give President Trump any credit for doing the right thing.
Okay, Ben, you're familiar with clinical trials, and we've talked about that on last week's show, but we are seeing now the politics and what Biden is saying is mandatory masks for everybody.
Well, look, wearing masks is advisable, so I urge people to wear masks in public. But the true impact of mask wearing, if they are not N95 masks, and I almost never see a mask that is an N95 mask, which actually restricts the transmission of viral-sized particles into or out of your respiratory system. We've gone to these masks that have very limited impact other than kind of stopping your own particles from spreading widely, which is positive. So the science, though, is largely being ignored at this point. This is purely a political issue. You have universities shutting down because University of North Carolina, 30,000 students has just canceled the on-campus activities, gone to full online school system for the rest of the fall because 146 students tested positive for COVID. Of course, 146 students. I'm shocked that the number is so low that there's only 146 positive students out of 30,000 students at the school. And that's where we're at. This expectation that we have to be at zero before we can reopen. That's insanity. Sweden has kept their economy open through this entire process. Their numbers are great. Their loss of life is better than most of the rest of Europe. And the science is very clear. We need to be open. We can operate fine. We're on the cusp of a vaccine. I expect one or more approved vaccines before the election. And we just need to get open. This is insanity at this point.
Yes, it sure is. And with elections going on, and that's going to be happening in just a couple of months, November the 3rd, we encourage you to get out and vote. Make your voice heard, because every voice does count. This is Wehman, Brunson, and Vernuccio Inside the News. Frank Vernuccio. You can find him at usagovpolicy.com. He's with the analysis. So help me out here, Frank. What is it?
The New York Analysis of Policy and Government.
There we go. And then we've got Ben Brunson, the author of the Falstaff, Enigma, and Esther, Sling. You can find him at benbrunson.com, amazon.com. We are heard on affiliates across the country, SoundCloud, YouTube, and AUN TV. We're going to take our first time out. We're going to be back.
You're listening to Wehman, Brunson, and Vernuccio, Inside the News.